Good evening in Athens and good morning in California, Professor Cull. I'm Renee Maltezou, covering general and political news for Reuters in Greece, and I'd like to welcome you all to the first Public Diplomacy Talks Forum, an event which is organized by the Greek Foreign Ministry's General Secretariat for Public Diplomacy, and which is meant to kick off a series of annual events and debates on interesting public diplomacy topics. Hopefully next year we'll be able to meet in person. But until then, we'll need to get used to these new means of conferencing. So it's a great pleasure to welcome Nicholas Cull, Professor of Public Diplomacy at the University of Southern California, a pioneer in public diplomacy teaching and research, Stathis Kalyvas, Gladstone Professor of Government at the University of Oxford and an insightful political analyst, and of course the Secretary General for Public Diplomacy, Konstantinos Alexandris, who embraced the Public Diplomacy Initiative and this event tonight. Today, we'll examine whether a country can reverse its negative image, and we'll focus on the case of Greece because it's a country which in the past decade was widely cited by international media and institutions globally as the European Union's weakest link. Yet today, the same country is being praised by the international community for its handling of another crisis, a different crisis, the coronavirus pandemic. So, how can Greece fix reputation damage during the debt crisis? And what methods does public diplomacy use to contribute in that? To what extent do current affairs sway public opinion? And can public diplomacy help but extend a positive momentum? Our distinguished guests will address these and many more questions. And please feel free to register your questions in the box on the side of your screens, because there will be a Q&A towards the end of the session. And for now, we'll watch a video from the Deputy Foreign Minister for Diaspora Greeks, Konstantinos Vlasis, and then the Secretary General will take the floor.
Mr. Secretary General, esteemed professors, dear participants, I'm very pleased to address this very first public diplomacy talk. I would like to congratulate the General Secretariat for Public Diplomacy and the Secretary General, Mr. Kostis Alexandris, for their initiative to organize a series of conferences on this extremely interesting and important subject. In today's interconnected and rapidly evolving world, where information travels at high speeds, public diplomacy has become a vital part of a state's diplomatic outreach. Perceptions do matter in international politics and constitute a significant aspect of soft power. These perceptions are quite dynamic and volatile, as recent developments have shown. Therefore, promoting one's own image requires constant vigilance as well as a great deal of perceptiveness that will allow policymakers to grasp current trends. In this context, Prime Minister Kyriakos Mitsotakis and the Greek government has put particular emphasis on reshaping Greece's image in the world. Leaving the past behind, Greece has regained its credibility, being worldwide recognized as a successful model of economic recovery and growth following years of painful recession. The recent experience of the COVID-19, as well as the way Greece responded to Turkey's subversive actions in Evros, have reaffirmed our country's image as a state which can act as a credible security provider able to effectively deal with complex crises. Once again, I congratulate the organizers for their great initiative. I wish you all a productive and fruitful discussion.
Secretary General, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Renee. Dear professors, dear friends watching us online, today the General Secretariat for Public Diplomacy of the Foreign Ministry is launching Greek PD Talks, Public Diplomacy Talks. It is a forum scheduled to take place on an annual basis giving emphasis on exchanging views and best practices on issues related to public diplomacy. Just for the record, allow me to remind that the General Secretariat was established a year ago. Our mission is, among other things, to better streamline extrovert policies and projects of various agencies, as in the aftermath of the economic crisis, it has become more and more urgent to reshape our national image to the world. We are very happy and honored that this first panel of Greek PD Talks is hosting two distinguished academics, Professor Nicholas Cull of the University of Southern California and Professor Stathis Kalyvas of the University of Oxford. Thank you so much, professors, for supporting with your presence and participation the launch of this forum. Your expertise will be extremely useful and helpful to all of us involved with public diplomacy. Many thanks also to our moderator, Ms. Renee Maltezou, an Athens-based Reuters correspondent, as well as to each and every one of you following this inaugural discussion online due to post-COVID restrictions. Today's panel is dealing with the question how to turn the tide, how to reverse a negative image. Having left behind a decade-long socio-economic crisis, Greece appears today much more extrovert and self-confident. During the last 11 months, the Greek government has managed to tackle a series of challenges, COVID-19 being the latest one, in an effective manner. Our citizens saw the state acting in an organized way, taking measures and adapting political decisions to the guidance received from the experts. We saw our public administration go digital and become, at last, more effective and less bureaucratic. We saw a public health system rising to the challenge in spite of having felt the consequences of a decade-long austerity. The major result of the above, the Greek people's restored confidence in state institutions. Now, how all this has affected the way the world sees Greece. As you know, monitoring the image of Greece, how the image of Greece is reflected in international media is an important element of our job here. According to the data we gathered, 2019 was the first year in a decade where positive comments on our country outweighed the negative ones. What is even more interesting is that Greece's image is moving away from the negative stereotypes that were predominant during the past 10 years. To be more specific, a few years ago, the trend tags for Greece were words like pariah, Brexit of course, failed state, or debt. In 2019, trending tags were progress, revitalize, repair, restore, and secure. So this new trend, as we see, is going on also in the first months of 2020. International media are full of favorable reports on how Greece addressed the pandemic. We see a plethora of articles praising Greece's strong leadership, the high level of society's awareness, and the maturity of its population. We see reports on the vigilance of Greek citizens. We see the media commending the government's commitment to support businesses, employees, and the unemployed, and to restart tourism and the economy. So what we see above all is a conversation about the country regaining international trust for its endeavors and sacrifices after so many years of hard criticism and disdain. So what all this mean for our country's international profile? As Ms. Maltezou said some questions a while ago, how can we maintain this momentum? How we can capitalize on this renewed confidence in terms of economic growth? How can public diplomacy utilize certain methods and techniques in order to advance this positive image? Dear friends, Our primary goal at the General Secretariat for Public Diplomacy is to leave behind the times of introversion, to rediscover our extrovert nature as a nation, and bring forward a country that innovates, grows, and regains its active role internationally. Therefore, the question about how to turn the tide looks more timely than ever. Professor Kalyvas, the floor is yours. We look forward to hearing your insight and suggestions. I would also like to encourage all those following the panel to actively engage and to not hesitate to put forward their questions in order to make this discussion truly lively and interactive. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Alexandris. Let's turn to Professor Cull now for his insight on the matter. Professor Cull, what methods does public diplomacy use, and how can Greece make the most of it?
Sure. Well, hopefully I can switch to a presentation. Okay, great. So what I want to talk about today is I'll eventually get to enhancing the image of Greece. But first of all, I want to give you a sense of the public diplomacy environment as it stands at the moment and why public diplomacy is so important. And for me, the way I talk about it is that I see the world as having changed so that your reputation isn't just a nice extra for a country, but now it's actually part of your security. So I like to talk about reputational security, the benefit of security that comes from having a good reputation. And this is why it's so important for Greece. First of all, I want to talk about the foundations for public diplomacy in the world we live in right now. I want to talk about 7 ongoing issues that affect every country, and then I'll get down into the issues for Greece and some next steps for Greece. I have a final slide, which I hope will assist in this process of brainstorming responses for Greece. And my overall theme is that this is no longer a time when you can go it alone in your public diplomacy, that whatever public diplomacy strategy Greece selects, it should be one that is based on partnering and working with others. So first of all, the foundations of our moment in public diplomacy. Well, my colleague Simon Anholt likes to say that there's only one superpower left in the world. And when he says this at a conference, all the Americans, they sort of sit up straight in their chairs, but he has to tell them, but the name of that one superpower is public opinion. Public opinion, global public opinion, is essential for anything in the world to happen. That's why public opinion is so divided and kept apart and uncohesive, because if it was cohesive, it would be an unstoppable force. So it's very much a contested space. Publics are central to foreign policy, and this is why public diplomacy is so relevant. We live in a strange moment in terms of our media and public space, because this is a moment of technological transition. Social media is still pretty new. And what I found as a historian is that when a new technology comes in, there's a 10-15 year period when people don't quite know how to use the technology, and it becomes a very destabilizing force in international affairs. I would say that new technology of communications and the instability it causes is one of the causes of the First World War, one of the causes of the Second World War. We don't think about it in that way because the historical personalities and the countries involved are much more commanding to the historic imagination. But the destabilization of technology is there, and it's made worse when there is a economic problem. So I think you can look at new technology and communication as being just like a virus. It comes along, it finds people don't have immunity, maybe they're weak for other reasons, and it can cause tremendous problems. In time, you develop immunity. In the case of media, you develop a skepticism to that media, you understand its limits, and society can right itself again. But until that happens, we live in a very, very dangerous moment. I think that the economic difficulties for everyone have made paying for public diplomacy more difficult. And the nature of our new communication technology is that states don't have particular credibility as voices the way they once did. Now, we look for credible media from somebody or a voice that is like our own, not a nation state speaking to us from above. And communication is passed much more horizontally than it ever was in the past. And this means that there are special communications problems for nation states, which are necessarily not like the people they're trying to talk to abroad, because those are foreign audiences, and it's more difficult for a state to take part in person-to-person communication, to introduce information onto a network that can be passed along horizontally. For all these reasons, I think we've come to this moment of reputational security, where if a country is known and liked and admired in the world, then a lot can be achieved. But if a country is not understood and something bad happens, then the countries of the world don't line up, don't help it. This was the problem for Ukraine 5 years ago. Nobody really knew what Ukraine was for in the world, and the dominant narrative about Ukraine was the same one that you were hearing from states that were hostile to Ukraine. It's so important to talk about your image, to have a good reputation, to be engaging with publics. I see public diplomacy as changing from the kind of public diplomacy we had in the 1990s, where the challenge was for a state to tell a good story about itself and to communicate directly with publics. Now I see the challenge as being more to empower the speaker you want to speak to on your behalf. So I think we're moving towards a public diplomacy that is based on empowerment, and that is looking towards involvement of the nation state in collective activity, for no other reason than the problems we face, such as the virus, such as mass migration, such as climate change. These problems are too big for any one country to deal with on its own. Within public diplomacy, we see a number of problems that are common to all states. The first and the most serious problem, in my belief, is a failure to connect or allow ships. Many times, if you look at an embassy or a foreign ministry Twitter feed, you'll find that they're following nobody. It's purely being used as a new way of pushing out material, not engaging and connecting with people. Secondly, we live in an era where there's failures to cooperate, where some countries, including my own, the UK, are walking away from international collaborations at the very time we should be doing more and working more together. Thirdly, public diplomacy is sometimes used as a form of domestic promotion. So, for example, when China puts up a big display in Times Square, New York City, all about Chinese people, Chinese products, they're not really trying to reach American people. They're trying to say to their own people, see what a good job this country does of restoring global respect for China. Public diplomacy is too difficult a job to be expected to serve domestic political purposes. It needs to be allowed to do the job of engaging foreign publics for their own sake, not just to help the legitimacy of whichever government is in power at home. Fourthly, there's a tremendous mismatch right now between the historical identities that people have and the transnational realities. People move from one country to another in the course of their life. They have complex multi-state identities in many cases, and we need to have ways of thinking and talking about international relations that are open to these kinds of realities and not expecting the nation state to be the sole player. Fifthly, public diplomacy can't be all about you. It can't be all about saying, my country is great. It has to be about addressing issues and a country being relevant to issues. And here I'm quite frustrated with Britain's emphasis on puffing up particular elements of British culture and life rather than addressing shared problems. I see tremendous danger in foreign ministries talking about winning when they're also talking about relationships. You cannot hope to win a relationship. Relationships have to be based on mutual success. In fact, the desire to win a relationship is one of the signs of psychosis. So we need to think about mutual success in our public diplomacy, and maybe we could start to talk about our ability to collaborate as being one of the positive features of the nation state as a whole. China does this when it talks to Africa about its win-win strategy. Britain has tried this in India, saying Britain's great, but it's great for collaboration. So these are some of the overall problems we face. For Greece in particular, you know the problems. It's associated with the financial crisis, associated with the refugee crisis. It's been valued for its leisure rather than its industry. So even when people have a positive idea about Greece, their positive is associated with sitting on the beach at Santorini, seeing a beautiful historic monument. It's not about a partner, a country for progress and solving problems in the world going forward. Fourth, Greece can't lie about realities. There are problems in Greece, and these have to be talked about, but maybe it can talk about shared solutions and be relevant in that way. It is possible. You can make the best of positives where they are relevant to international audiences, and you can invest in the future. It's always a good time to begin the long-term changes that lead to positive reputation. My belief is that the reason Germany is the #1 brand in the world right now is because of investment in the German brand 120 years ago, and then maintaining the investment over the years. I feel that Greece can be of value to the global effort in things that people care about, and I'll speak about that a little more later on. So, turning them to the next steps. The first step in a public diplomacy process is always to listen. And as Greece steps out into the world, it has to listen to who you, as Greeks, think that you are, and to get a clear idea of what you feel you can and should contribute to the world, because the foreign ministry cannot do anything that is ahead of or adrift from the thoughts of the public. Secondly, you need to listen to who we, as foreigners, think you are, and understand that Greece has different meanings in different places and has different meanings for different generations. So to understand the shape of the image of Greece to the world and how it changes from place to place. Find ways to make the best of your strengths, of course, but also look for reputation as being everyone's business. I think the most successful turnarounds in terms of image are where an entire community is encouraged to think of itself as contributing to the overall image of the country. So sometimes, for example, the I Love New York campaign in New York City in the late 70s and early 80s changed the behavior of New Yorkers rather than the opinion of people living outside the city. It actually helped people live the positive image of New York, which in turn changed the reality of New York. I think it's a mistake to tie things to the government, as governments change, and not everybody likes one government at a time. So if there's ways of connecting it to apolitical forces in the country, that's a good idea. It's essential to look to the longer term. And to me, the best idea is to seek out what Greece can contribute to the things that the world needs right now. So look at the big issues and think, well, which parts of these big issues does Greece have competence in and can be seen to make a difference in? I like to do a process of brainstorming, and at this point you're probably thinking, well, why is there a picture of a bottle of beer on the screen? The answer is that this is a way into thinking about the way in which a nation state that has had a problematic image can reposition itself based on the things that are already important about that place to foreigners. This bottle of beer comes from Iceland. And what happened was there was a businessman in Iceland and in the United States looking for ways of, well, basically making money. And in Iceland, looking for ways of building positive industries in Iceland. And an external businessman came up with the idea of brewing beer in Iceland. And this made sense because Iceland has water, all that meltwater coming off glaciers and so forth. But also, it fitted the image of Iceland. As a Nordic country, people thought, well, it's associated with Vikings, it's associated with sort of big parties deep into the night, and it's a place that you would expect beer to come from. So Icelandic beer fitted the image and it fitted the resources. The curious thing is the one thing it didn't fit with was Icelandic history, because for the last, well, for most of the 20th century, Iceland had very strict prohibition laws. So it did not have a domestic beer industry. So what I'm saying here is that part of making a successful business in Iceland was to work with what people expected the place to be good at, and then retroactively to deliver the industry or the engagement activity that fitted that reality. And I think that same process could be seen in Greece and might suggest a way forward for Greece. When I visited Greece for the first time as a person interested in politics and in democracy, the first thing I wanted to do, the first place I wanted to go, was not the Parthenon, but I wanted to go to the Pnyx to see where the world's first democratic assembly had taken place. And so I found maps, I got there, but when I found the place, I found that there was just a rusty old sign that had been put up, 50 years ago by the American school. There was nothing substantial there. There was no interpretation there. And it seemed that a whole opportunity to talk about Greece's relevance to the world had been missed. I shared this with a person who was interested in medicine, and he'd actually done the same thing. He came to Greece and went to Kos because he wanted to see things to do with Hippocrates and the Hippocratic Oath, and found that actually there was nothing there. There was no living monument to these things that are still part of our lives. And it seemed that there was so much in Greece that was about the gods we don't think about anymore, and nothing for the gods, if you like, or the values that are still essential to modern life. And I wonder if there are ways of better engaging or better leveraging the meaning of Greece in these important issues around these selective aspects of culture. It also occurred to me that it's important to seek out the special bilateral relationships that Greece has. There are many places in the world that have a special relationship with Greece. I was thinking, for example, of South Korea and the connection to Greece around the Korean War, Greece's investment in retaining the Greek Orthodox churches, in maintaining those in Korea, and these kinds of tiny little, maybe even sort of missable elements in relationships that can be celebrated and brought forward. One of the most important public diplomacy activities, actually, is thanking other countries, rather than asking them for things or telling them things, if you can begin a relationship by saying thank you for a past support or a past connection. And this can be very, very pleasing to publics. I was very touched when I went to Armenia to find so many things named after Lord Byron, and that Byron was still a very much alive character for Armenian people, and that I think can be a great conversation starter in public diplomacy. When it comes to new media, the big mistake that countries make and foreign ministries make is that they tend to they fail to segment their social media. So they want to have one feed that addresses everything, and they push it out to everybody who is following them. And the truth is, nobody is interested in everything you do. You are much better served as a foreign ministry or as an embassy if you pick subject-specific, if you develop subject-specific feeds, and then if you work to serve a particular network. So an example of this was about 10 years ago now, the British government decided that it was going to empower its ambassador to arms control in Geneva to develop a social network around arms control. And they said to him, look, we want you to be of service to that network. You have to respond to people. You have to introduce people to each other as if you were running a party, like a cocktail party. And you have to be free to say whatever you want. So they gave him complete carte blanche to speak around the issue of arms control. And I think that it's important that the foreign ministry, if it wants people to engage in social media, allows them to be themselves online, allows them to behave like proper hosts or proper members of their network, and that means responding instantly and to be empowered to be personalities in their network. And that takes courage on the part of the administrators of a public diplomacy section, but I feel experience has shown that that's really the only way to do it, to build a network that is specific to a subject and then work to serve that network. Well, in conclusion, there are no magic answers, and you have to expect a long process. But if you start with listening, if you engage over time, then the results will come. I'm very encouraged that Greece is asking the right questions about this, and I think the COVID-19 story is an excellent place to start. Partnering for the future is an excellent place to move forward an important international conversation. Thank you so much for your attention. I appreciate it. This is my email and Twitter handle. You're welcome to be in touch if there's more you want to say. And this is the cover of my book, which deals with public diplomacy principles in general. Thank you so much for your attention. I look forward to our questions. Now, just a moment while I exit from this screen. Hopefully that worked. And now can we go back to camera? How's that?
Thank you, Professor Cull. Professor Kalyvas, we would like to hear your thoughts on the issue. And is the moment ripe for Greece to invest in its image?
Absolutely. I was fascinated by Nick's talk, and I have to specify that I come to this conversation as a complete non-specialist on the question of public diplomacy. And in fact, I've always found the idea of trying to shape perceptions and attitude about you, whether you're an individual, whether you're a firm, whether you're a political organization or a state, to be extremely difficult to study because there's so many contradictory forces that play in it. One of the insights I have, which is not based on any research, but on my understanding of social and political processes, is that very often trying very hard to game the process, to second guess the process, can be counterproductive. And so I'm very much in the same line with what was mentioned right now, that you have to be, in a sense, listening to what's happening and trying to figure out, and this is what I'm going to talk mostly about.
Should we answer your questions until you can log in, Renee?
I'm sorry, I
can you hear me?
Should we go to questions until you can log in?
Professor Cull, can you hear us?
I can hear you, yes.
Professor Kalyvas is still on, no?
No, it says he's loading.
Oh.
He probably cannot hear me.
Probably, yes. It's probably your connection, Professor Cull. So we'll continue.
It's mine.
It's probably your connection, yes, because we can. I can see Professor Kalyvas. Let us know if you have any problems in the Q&A, please, with the connection. If you can see all of the.
Sorry, I can't see him at all.
Professor Kalyvas, why don't you go on? And if there is a problem,
okay.
we'll. Yeah.
Okay, very good. I'm sorry, because I was, in fact, addressing some of the issues that Professor Cull was raising. So what I want to do in these very brief remarks is to...
I'm not getting anything.
Yeah, there's a problem with...
Just give us a second, we'll check with the...
Okay. So I wanted to precisely point out that some of the issues that we can start from in order to think about the public image of Greece, which has necessarily to be our own understanding of our self-image. I think that's the very basic question that we need to ask. So to start from the beginning, the main starting point is that Greece underwent a period of 10 years of very intense crisis, in which its image, it is argued, was primarily negative. It was the epicenter of a lot of trouble, of negative news, and it created, or it is said to have shaped a perspective about Greece that was not a good one. There is the old saying that no news is good news, and indeed, I would say that the moment in the Greek crisis that really I remember were the moment in which the universe of international media was present in Athens, covering the news. I wanted to thank you for your presentation, which gives me the ideal opportunity to latch on a number of themes. And I started by saying that I come to this conversation without being a specialist or in any way familiar with the concept of public diplomacy. But I've always been fascinated by the ways in which people and organizations throughout history have grappled with the idea of trying to shape their public image and trying to shape how information reaches audiences. And one of the things that very often comes up in a variety of different settings is when you try too hard, when you try to second guess and to game the system, very often you produce counterproductive effects. And I think that's one of the things that emerges from the lessons that you draw from your own analysis, that the process of, in a sense, presenting yourself in a way that is positive has to be very organic. And so I want to talk to that. I will start by just saying that in the last 10 years, as everyone knows, Greece was at the epicenter of the major global crisis. And the news that came out of Greece were always uniformly negative. And in fact, whenever I was in Athens, I knew things were going badly for Greece when thousands of journalists would storm in the center of Athens. I remember, in fact, going to the Reuters building and studying in the terrace of that building overlooking Constitutional Square to give interviews, and all the hotels around the Constitutional Square in the center of Athens were full of television crews interviewing various people and retransmitting, broadcasting the news from Greece. And these were the most terrible moments in my memory. And this is a very interesting contradiction, because very often global coverage is seen as a positive thing, but not in the case of Greece. Now, if you look at the actual image of Greece, it's during the crisis was much more complicated than just negative. There was at the beginning of the crisis a sense of Greece having falsified its statistics. The term Greek statistics came to existence at that time, and there was a sense that Greeks were presented as, lazy free riders that took advantage of European money to live good lives without contributing. But that image, if you look at the details, very, very quickly was overshadowed by another image, which can also be perceived as negative, but in a sense had a less negative element. And that was the image of Greece as a victim of Europe, a victim of the Eurozone, a victim of Germany, a victim of international capitalism. And in fact, this image of victim is, I think, much more deeply rooted. Because it became a sort of unifier of very different constituencies from the left-wing populists of Podemos in Spain, who saw the Greek case as the one that was going to bring in radical change in Europe, to the Brexiteers in the UK, who saw in Greece the example for why Britain, the UK should leave the European Union. So the image of the victim was not uniformly negative in that the Greeks were no longer blamed for their fate. But it was negative in the sense that the Greeks and Greece was seen as no longer master of its own fate, no longer the agent of its future. And I think that is a very negative image, but it's a very different negative image than the first one to emerge, and probably more difficult and more challenging to reverse. The other version of those 10 years came from the refugee crisis. And the image that came out of Greece during the refugee crisis was not negative. But I'm going to argue, in fact, it was also negative. The image that came out was of Greeks being very helpful to refugees coming from Turkey and seeking to reach various countries in Western Europe. And this image, I think, is effectively negative because it was not entirely truthful. The reason why many Greeks were not hostile was because they saw the refugees as just crossing the country, not staying in the country. And the problem is that if you push that image, when in fact it is not rooted necessarily, in reality you then are confronted to contradictions. And that goes to the heart of one of the many of the lessons that Professor Cull mentioned, that you shouldn't cater to domestic public opinion, that your image is not the result of that. So I would argue that a good analysis of the actual negative dimension of Greece's image is still to be done. And very often we are left with the wrong impression of what negative image Greece has. Now, in 2019, things started changing. There was an election, a change of government, a sense of optimism emerging in Greece. The numbers in terms of GDP growth started being positive. There was a sense of possibility. And that was reflected very much in surveys showing that Greeks were very optimistic. In fact, the numbers in surveys of optimism in December of 2019 were extremely high, had never been seen in Greece before. So that was remarkable, but it proved to not to have been very long lasting, because the COVID pandemic essentially destroyed that narrative. And in its place, surprisingly, it puts another positive narrative, which is the image of Greece managing the pandemic in an effective way, which has been quite well managed. There's been a number of very high-profile interviews that the Greek Prime Minister gave to CNN and other places that pushed this image. The coverage by the media has been very positive, and even public intellectuals on a global scale, like Yuval Harari, for example, mentioned Greece as an exemplar in that respect. Now, that's very positive, but the problem here is that it's not necessarily connected to a to a particular aspect of Greek identity and image, which can be, in a sense, long-lasting. and has the ability to generate dividends in the long term. The reason is, number one, I would argue, performance and effectiveness are not necessarily Greece's strong points. And the second is that there is now an economic crisis coming in that is going to be very challenging, and it will threaten whatever positive spin emerges from the COVID pandemic. So I would argue COVID in itself is not necessarily a sort of golden ticket for Greece to move forward. And so I'm going to conclude with a few thoughts about what I think perhaps is worth pushing as Greece's image. The sort of standard stock set of examples that people go back when they think about Greece come in two types of images and ideas. The first one is classical antiquity. And I think that's both overused and it can be quite superficial, even though it's something that really has a global reach. So my argument has always been that Greece needs to go beyond references to classical antiquity, that in and of themselves, those references are not necessarily the most helpful ones. The second set of references are references to leisure, as Nick mentioned, to vacations, to holidays, to having a good time. And as was mentioned by him, these are also problematic because they are not necessarily associated with a set of values that can be used in a way that will give Greece a sort of positive connotation. People like to have a good time, but you are not going to be an effective player if you just are perceived as the place in which people come to party. So what could be the basis, the foundation for rethinking Greece's image? Because at the end of the day, the core of public diplomacy has to be a very good self-understanding of what Greece today stands for in a sort of global way. And I would like to argue that there are a number of ideas percolating, that we need to cultivate those ideas, and that those ideas have to come together in an organic way to create the core of our new self-understanding as Greeks, which eventually we can push in the global arena in a way that resonates, in a way that uses others to push it for us, very much along the lines that the book Public Diplomacy suggests. And I would point to two of those elements that are worth brainstorming about as the foundation of this sense of self-identity and self-image for Greece. The first one is a need to reassess the modern history of Greece as opposed to the classical history of Greece. And the history of modern Greece is very little known, both by Greeks, I would argue, and of course by non-Greeks. And at the core of the history of modern Greece is an element of pioneering, a pioneering dimension, which has been emphasized by historians of modern Greece, people like Mark Mazaur and others. And it basically consists of Greece being one of the first new nations, a very early post-colonial nation, which eventually made it to the core of modern European nations. Not completely, not fully, but has been quite successful. And I think there is a lot of potential to draw from this perception of Greece as, in a sense, being a pioneering nation that had to build a modern state out of, in a sense, nothing, when it emerged in the mid-19th century on the global stage. So that's one aspect. The second aspect has to do with an element that many people who visit Greece as tourists and visitors glimpse, but do not necessarily catch and do not necessarily verbalize. And this is something that I've noticed in my capacity as teaching and organizing various summer courses in the past 20 years in Greece. And the thing that I find fascinating is the ability of delivering services such as education in a setting that is ideal. So what makes Greece an ideal setting for these kinds of interactions? I think it has to do with a very deep-seated sense of balanced life, which goes back to the antique classic idea of metron, and I think requires quite a lot of thinking, but I would argue that it is something that we can take advantage of. Greece is a place where people can come to recenter, to find themselves, to reconnect not only with who they are, with nature, with the environment, and with others. So it's a way to re-socialize people. This sounds a bit like New Age, but I think, and I'm very much convinced by my experience, that it's something that works very effectively when it comes to areas and domains such as communication, interaction, education. So I would argue the element of a pioneering new nation on the one hand, and the element of a connection with a sense of balance on the other hand, can constitute two elements of an image that we can build by listening to ourselves, to who we are, not necessarily by trying to fit the expectations of others about who Greeks are, and can constitute eventually the foundation of a variety of interventions globally, either in the realm of business, the economy, exports, etc., but also in the realm of public diplomacy as well. And having established a sense of who we are, we can build on in a variety of ways when it comes to particular issues and policies, very much following the agenda and the line that Nick Cull has outlined in his book. So I'll stop here, and I want to thank you very much for this opportunity to reflect on these very, I think, important issues for Greece.
Thank you very much, Professor Kalyvas. We're running out of time, unfortunately, as is always the case with interesting presentations and topics, but we'll take a few questions from our viewers. One which is addressed to you. I don't know, is Professor Cull still on? I can't see him. So,
can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. We can see you.
Go ahead with the question. And thank you, Stathis, for the response. That was very good, and I like the idea of pioneering nation and leading the way in post-coloniality. It's very good. It's very good. You know what? What's the question?
One of the questions was that there seems to be a systematic counter-campaign from some NGOs and activists in some media over the government's handling of the refugee crisis, the refugee issues. Is that affecting the country's image, and how?
Sorry, could you say that again? I've got a bit of background noise here.
Yes. There seems to be a systematic counter-campaign from some NGOs, activists. Can you hear it?
Right. Systematic campaign, yes.
Yes, counter-campaign from some NGOs, activists, and media over the government's handling of the refugee crisis and refugee issues. Is this affecting the government's image, and how?
I'm not aware of it. But with all of this, you have to pay attention to what's being said. But I'm not aware of that. But it sounds like something that needs to be monitored.
Mm-hmm.
I would add to that, if I may, it's a very difficult problem, but there are also positive aspects in that problem that have not always received enough attention. For example, Greece, a few months ago, launched the program of taking special care of unaccompanied minors among refugees. This was a very sort of quite well organized campaign of a very, very fraught problem, because these are among the weakest and most vulnerable subgroups within the refugee population. And even though my sense following those developments from people I know involved with it seems to suggest that it's been quite well managed, well run, and effective, I've heard very little about that aspect internationally. So it seems to be one of those issues that somehow don't manage to get out. Again, it's not necessarily, again, to go back to the book, it's not necessarily for the Greek government to do that, but to provide information so that concerned activists can latch onto that and give it enough publicity.
Yes, finding the right partner to speak about it is nobody wants to hear the Greek government talking about that, but empowering the right person to speak.
And Professor Kalyvas, what should the main narrative for Greece post-COVID be?
I don't have.
It's still not over, so. You know.
Yes, I don't have the narrative. Certainly, the fact that Greece managed that successfully so far is a good start, but it's vulnerable to two things. The first one is we don't know how the crisis is going to develop. So if you build an entire campaign on Greece's performance and then things go badly in the winter, you don't look very good. And the second thing is, of course, that priorities might switch to the financial and economic side, because that is going to be the big economic crisis coming in on its heels. So that can affect also perceptions. So I would say we need to think beyond effectiveness. What are the aspects of the way in which the COVID pandemic has been handled so far in Greece that are worth outlining? And having spent the lockdown in Athens, I have many ideas about that. I was very surprised by the way things were handled. I would emphasize very much the idea of balance. That on the one hand, the lockdown was very tough. The demands it made on people were very restrictive. But at the same time, the way in which people handled it was also very flexible, very down to earth. We didn't see any frictions. People managed to adapt to it very effectively. So I would very much go back to the themes that I discussed before. The issue of adaptability, the issue of balance, the issue of managing something that's very adverse in a way that in fact can be very effective at the grassroots. These are themes that are worth thinking about. But certainly I don't have. And I think it's too early to have a set narrative. I think what is important, and what I emphasized before, is the importance of having a general narrative about our identity, from which then we can derive particular narratives about specific issues.
Mm-hmm. Professor Cull, can public diplomacy help Greece prepare or offset the negative impact that another economic recession may have on Greece's image, given that it may evoke memories of the debt crisis again, even though it's not connected directly?
Well, I think the thing is that it depends how Greece is presenting itself. And if you're presenting yourself as the economic business powerhouse of the world, then an economic crisis will challenge that image. But if you're presenting yourself as a country that is partnering around the important issues, that has original contributions to make, then the debt crisis would be, or economic crisis becomes irrelevant to that. The point is to be known to be about things that are real and true, and that fit with what the world needs. And economic needs are only one part of the story. And I can see that the recession is challenging, but it needn't wipe out all the benefits and positive narratives and the sorts of things that Stathis have been talking about. I mean, he's not saying that let's talk about Greece as, the economic powerhouse of the Mediterranean, talking about it in real terms. That doesn't have to be negated. And you can still be an innovative country, a country that brings people into decisions and comes up with innovative solutions, whether the economy is good or bad.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And Professor Kalyvas, how can we get rid of the stereotype, one of our viewers asks, of all the other countries are to blame for Greece's problems, which is, I think, a great perception.
Could you please repeat your question, because you broke down? Oh, I couldn't hear it.
So, I'm sorry. Basically, the question is, get read, says one of our viewers, of the perception that all other countries are to blame for Greece's problems, which is a Greek, I think, a stereotypic, perception.
Well, I don't think it's exclusively a Greek perception. People always tend to blame others, and the others can be, people outside their family, their neighborhood, their city, their region, their nation. It's an easy way to deflect blame, and it's a natural human reaction. Taking responsibility.
Oh, the connection broke.
Can you hear me now?
Professor Cull, can you hear
Yes.
me? Can I ask you, that's another question coming from one of our viewers. How can
Oh, you're going quiet. Say again.
social media shape the public image of the country? How can social media shape the public image of a country? Professor Kalyvas, we'll get back to you. The connection is broken.
Well, I feel that it's right now people overemphasize social media. That the important thing is the reality, not the particular platform that you're using. So I wouldn't immediately go to social media and say, oh, what we need is digital Greece or something like that. I think what you need is the reality, and then the social media can follow and can build on that reality. So I think it's dangerous to assume that the answer is more social media. Mm-hmm. There will be things in Greece that people outside of the country think are important because of social media. And quite often foreign ministries have no idea about things like successful YouTubers. I did a talk like this in Canada and found that there were nobody in the Canadian Senate was aware that the most famous Canadian woman in the world was a YouTuber. She's working with the UN in public diplomacy, but they hadn't heard of her. So you will find that you already have resources in social media, but it's just in the 10 to 15-year-old demographic. So it's one of the things you can certainly work with, but don't assume that it'll be the miracle cure.
Mm-hmm. And Professor Kalyvas, you were saying, I think your microphone is off.
What was the question again?
It was about the perception that other countries are to blame for Greece's problems.
Yes, thank you. I was saying that it's a natural tendency of people to deflect blame. And so the question to ask is, how can we make it so that people can take responsibility without necessarily feeling that they're being blamed as the sole culprits, so to speak. There's no easy answer to that, and very often a lot of these issues have to do with how questions and issues are being framed. So framing is a very important process, as you know, and we need to restate questions sometimes in a way that takes blame out of the picture. Otherwise, we can get bogged down in conversations that are not very productive.
Mm-hmm. One more question for you. How do you think the 2021 celebrations could work in forming a narrative for Greece?
I think it's a unique opportunity to take advantage to sort of showcase some of the achievements of Greece in the last 200 years, especially the achievements that are not well known. So, for example, to give an example of that, probably Nick and most people outside Greece don't know that in the 1920s, 100 years ago, Greece received 1,200,000 Greek refugees from Anatolia as part of a process of population exchange.
With the changes to Turkey.
It's a famous historical event most people don't know about, and Greece was a country at the time of 5 million. So how did the country of 5 million absorb 1,200,000 successfully? Greece did it, and it was successful in that. So these people have become part of Greece, even though they came from a very different background, sometimes not even speaking Greek. So the integration of refugees is a story that's worth telling as part of Greece's achievements.
That's really interesting, yes.
I think we've lost Renee this time.
Now we've lost Renee, yes. Oh no, she really has gone.
Yes. I read the conclusions to your book and some parts of the book. I found them fascinating. It's a field that I don't know much about, and it actually connects with so many other fields.
Yes, I know. I love the way it connects with social psychology, particularly. I think that's
exactly. So it's a very interesting area to work on.
Yes, it's funny because it isn't always. It's one of those things where at some points it isn't a very fashionable thing to work on, and then suddenly it becomes important again. So I feel that I owe a lot to Mr. Bin Laden and Mr. Putin and the other characters who remind everybody that actually international image and communication are important in world affairs.
And then you have to take into account all the changes in technology, which is another field.
Every new technology stirs it up again. That's right.
So Renee, you're back with us.
Thank you. Yes, I'm back with you. I could hear you, but you couldn't see me, I think. So thank you so much. We're running out of time, unfortunately. So we can't take any more questions, but thank you so much for this interesting and fruitful discussion and for participating in that. And I would also like to thank our viewers, of course, for bearing with us and putting up with our connection problems. So enjoy the rest of the day, and we can continue this discussion anyway through social media.
Well, I would expect that we continue this discussion in the future in Athens, as opposed to.
Yes. Thank you.
Yes, please.
That would be very nice. Or in Oxford, Stathis.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Have a good day.
Bye-bye.